Thank you for coming out in whatever potential bad weather, but and I guess somebody has some sort of form of notification if we are in extreme weather danger, and you can speak up or let us know if something's going to happen. But otherwise, we're going to continue studying in God's Word, and we're in Hosea chapter 4. We talked about last week is divided generally, usually, to two sections, chapters 1 through 3, and then chapters 4 through 14. There have been others who divided it into sections of 5 sections, or even one person, 14 sections. But chapters 1 through 3 is like his life and God telling him to marry a woman or women, and then the 3 children, and that he becomes an object lesson. So we begin in chapter 4, and from here on out, it's pretty much negative against the leaders, against the people, and it's confirming that God is saying, "My people have treated me as you've been treated, Hosea," and so it's rebuke. And he says, "Hear the word of the Lord," in verse 1, "you children of Israel." And the Lord has a, how do you have that translated?
Controversy.
Yeah, controversy. That is the Hebrew term riv, R-I-V. And can I erase anything here? Or
Yeah, that because the most of that is like notes from the ladies' class that met in here last night. Just some prayer things that.
okay.
But on the left there, where it says gifts of hospitality, that's just like the outline of the book they're studying. So
I can erase that?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I'll send the teacher.
I might need a piece of paper that you sign saying that I can erase it. The prophets, as some scholars have suggested, use what's called a lawsuit format, and that is this Hebrew term, riv. And it's Israel's in a binding agreement with Yahweh, and that's the berit, that's the covenant, and that's very serious to be in a binding agreement like that. And there are witnesses to that. And so the prophets, in a sense, are like lawyers. And they're calling Israel into court. I have this against you, as they're speaking for the one that people have broken berit or haven't kept it. Yes, exactly.
You say this, how you say this.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a very much argumentative.
Yeah.
Way that it's presented.
Yeah.
Like you said, lawyer.
And the Hebrew term for that is this riv, and that's the word we have there in verse 1. Adonai, the Lord, has a riv with those who dwell in the land, and so it's a.
The NIV says the Lord has a charge to bring.
Charge, you go to translation.
Legal term.
Yeah, charge. It has a legal background, and some commentators, argue whether you should understand it strictly, but it has that background to it. And the reason for that is because there is no truth, there is no chesed, loving kindness, or mercy, and there is no knowledge in the land. And so what you see in the land then is swearing, lying, killing, and so on, and they break all bounds. They break free, and so the land mourns, and the land mourns so that even it affects that. So in verse 4, then you don't strive. Do you have let no person strive in verse 4, or do you have
Contend?
You have contempt, but do you have don't do this, or do you have let no person do this? Okay. That the Hebrew can be understood as if he is saying don't strive, or it can be understood with let no man strive or nor reprove. Or it maybe it's either saying, don't do that, and there's the microphone right there. He's either saying don't do it, or he is saying that it's not happening with the leaders. And maybe the meaning is nobody's taking action in the land. The leaders are failing and nobody's taking action, might be the meaning of that. And even the prophet and the priest are guilty of that. And so we have the famous verse in verse 6, the people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. And knowledge, and the term to know and the verb to know, refers to a relationship, an intimate knowledge, more than knowledge of facts. The knowledge of fact, the intimate relationship knowledge is built on the knowledge of fact. If we don't know about God, we can't have a relationship with God. But yada means an intimate relationship. Sometimes it's even used for sexual relations of husband and wife. So they're destroyed. The people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. But he says, you, singular, have rejected knowledge, and so I reject you. You'll not be a priest to me. And so this is directly said to the priest, but it applies in a general way as well. They've forgotten the law of God. It was the work of the priest to teach Torah, to teach the law. And so the more they increase, the more they sinned against me. And they feed on the sin of my people, verse 8. It's like people, like priests. And I'll punish for their ways. And it'll be they'll eat and they won't have enough. Their desires won't be satisfied. Because in verse 10, you forsook, you ceased to listen to God. So, and it appears too that even the sins of prostitution, drunkenness are involved in this. And the people ask questions but you don't have anything to give to them. And so now the people are sacrificing all over the place, on the mountains, and their daughters commit prostitution, harlotry, and your daughters-in-law. So they chose this lifestyle. One rabbi said they chose this lifestyle of living in opposition to God, and then they chose the culture that would support that. And so they've chosen not to listen to God. The chief hindrance, like Jesus says in John chapter 7, the chief hindrance to faith is not intellectual, it's moral. If anyone is willing to do the will of my Father, then he shall know if my words are from God or not. It's that willing to do the will of the Father. I'm not saying there might not be, that there's not intellectual problems some people might have, but the chief hindrance is moral. People don't want to stop living in sin, so I don't want to listen to God. Yes.
This is a side note here, but he talks about harlotry wine and new wine take away your understanding. How does new wine take away your understanding? Verse 11.
In verse 11.
Grape juice.
It's just it is grape juice, but I think it would say, if it's sat around long enough, it's going to become wine. It's just a blanket statement that they're drinking and drunkenness and all that involved in it. Regardless of what we might think, what the Bible teaches about alcohol, I don't know whether we can push all the meanings of these different words to support whatever side we're on. And it doesn't necessarily, and I said drunkenness, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean drunkenness. It can mean that their focus is on those things. That's all they're focused on.
Could it not be that those are what they're sacrificing? Because harlotry is a form of their worship, and their sacrifices of wine and new wine could have been part of their worship.
Yeah.
And that is the worship of false idols that is against.
Yeah, that's certainly involved in it, as he says. In verse 13, he says, because of this, your daughters have commit harlotry. and your daughters-in-law commit adultery, they're influenced by your sin. So it's all involved in that, I would say. Now, strangely, he says in verse 14, I won't punish your daughters, and I won't punish your daughters-in-law. Why will he not do that?
Because the men are going, participating.
That's right. The men are consorting with prostitutes, and these are, and there are various Hebrew words that are used here that mean the temple prostitutes, the ritual harlots. And so the people then are without understanding. They're distraught. And so there is, it could be this physical prostitution that's involved in this all religion, but there's also the idea if God's people have turned away from God and they're worshiping other gods, that's prostitution. That's religious prostitution. So verse 15, you Israel play the harlot, but don't let Judah become guilty. And that kind of raises the question, who's the audience of this? And then he says, don't come to Gilgal, don't go up to Beit Aven, and don't swear as the Lord lives. Gilgal and Beit Aven were centers of idol worship in the north. In fact, Beit Aven, Bethaven, Beit means house. This is another name. It's a name for another place. It takes that other place and corrupts the name. And the other name, the name is famous place. It's Beit El or Bethel. But Beit El means house of God. Beit Aven means house of sin or iniquity. Aven means sin or iniquity. And this probably is referring to when Jeroboam the first, set up those idols of golden calves, and the people are worshiping up there. So house of God has become house of sin. And if the men of Judah worship the idols as they do in the north, then don't let them swear as the Lord lives. Israel is stubborn, like a stubborn heifer. And Ephraim in verse 17, that's another name that's used throughout for the northern Israel. They're joined to idols. Let them alone. When this rebellion is over, they're running to harlots, and their rulers deeply love this dishonor. The wind has bound her up in her skirts or her wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. Question? I kind of went through that and then stopped and asked for questions. And if you want to ask questions, just please ask or make comments or disagree.
I like verse 12 where it says, their walking staff gives them oracles. That's pretty bad when you take that as your God.
Yeah, their staff speaks to them.
Yeah.
And they're asking counsel of that. All right, any other statements or observations or questions? All right, it's going to continue the same in the following chapters, sadly. But in verse 5 is a warning. And so hear this then, you priest, house of Israel, house of the king. You have been a snare on Mizpah and a net spread on Tabor. And these are places. The Jewish commentators say that in these places, pilgrims going to Jerusalem were murdered. So if you're in the north, the temple's in the south, and so, it's not like every single person in the north was unfaithful to God, and so some would make that pilgrimage down to the south to go to the temple on the feast days. But the Jewish commentators say these places are mentioned because that's where the pilgrims were murdered. I don't know about that. But I'm rejected by these people. I mean, this is a warning. And so they need to return to their God. But verse 5, their pride is going to testify against their face. You will be humbled. And notice also, he says in verse 5, Israel and Ephraim, that's northern kingdom, shall stumble in their iniquity. Judah also shall stumble. You'll be humbled as well. They're apostates. They've dealt deceitfully against the Lord. They brought strange children. And it seems that Judah learned too much from the north. So verse 8, blow the trumpet, blow the horn in Gibeah and the trumpet in Ramah. And both of these places were on hills. So it'd be a place of alarm. So what next? You need to know that God's judgment is come. There's a failure of leadership and a failure of the people as well. And they're going to be oppressed. And so he gives some pictures here. In verse 12, I am as a moth, and to the house of Judah as rottenness. And so what does a moth do? It just, it can eat up your clothes. And this rottenness, and it seems it's from the inside out. And yet they saw how bad it was, verse 13, saw sickness, Judah's wound, but did they go to God? In verse 13, Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to, and what do you have there in verse 13? King somebody or...
J-A-R-E-V.
Okay, so somebody's name? Does anybody have anything else?
I have a side of the avenging king.
Yeah.
That just says the great king, or King Jehovah.
Okay, so it gives it as a name. The Hebrew is Yarev. If you would spell the Hebrew in the English, it'd be either J-A-R-E-V or Y-A-R-E-V. You notice the Reeve that's in that? R-I-V or R-E-V. That's that same Reeve, that contention. And so it's, in a sense, like a nickname, King Contentious or something along that line. And it's probably one of the kings of Assyria. You went to him. Menachem in 2 Kings 15 sent a tribute to Assyria to try to, it's like bribing them, buying them off. And so you saw your sickness, you went to Assyria, you're sent to whoever this king is, you're trying to buy your way out of this, but is he going to be able to heal you? No. Will he cure you of your wound? No. And then God says, I'll be as a lion, and then as a young lion. And these are terrifying pictures. I want to get this before this goes off, and I have to try to get down there and get it. So I'm drinking coffee, putting the phone in my pocket, reading from a book. There is a book, let me see if I can find the name of that author. The entire book is it's on lions in the Hebrew Scriptures. Can't find the name of it right now, but lions occur like 20-something times in the Minor Prophets, and there are 5 vocabulary words for lions. So you have like female lions, lioness. You have young lions. You have sometimes probably synonyms of lions. And then we have here in Hosea 3 references where God says he is a lion. And there's in 2 of these references, it's judgment. He's coming as a lion. It says should be a scary thing. And then in 1, it's hope. So let's look. The first one here is in 5:14. So he says, I'll be as a lion and as a young lion to the house of Judah, and I'll tear and go away, and I'll take away, and there will be nobody to deliver. So that's judgment. Look over at chapter 13, verses 7 and 8. Somebody read that for us.
So I will be to them like a lion, like a leopard by the road I will lurk. I will meet them like a bear deprived of her cubs. I will tear open their rib cage, and there I will devour them like a lion. The wild beast shall tear them.
All right, that's judgment too. And he links in leopard and a bear even when the cubs are taken away. And I'll tear open the rib cage, the enclosure of their heart. He's not their protector. He will be their destroyer here. I will devour them. And so those 2 references in Hosea are talking about judgment. Now look at chapter 11 and verse 10. Somebody read that for us.
They will walk after the Lord, he will roar like a lion, indeed he will roar, and his sons will come thundering from the west.
Okay, and this is in a context where God is saying, I will deliver you, I'll bring you back. But he will, and he's still a lion there. See the verse before that, verse 9, I will not come in fury, I'm the Holy One in the midst of you. And he says, he'll roar like a lion, he's going to destroy Assyria and Egypt. He'll destroy their enemies, and he'll bring his children back. Now they will come trembling because the lion has roared. I mean, you don't treat God lightly, but that is hope. That's God as a lion with hope. And one person said about God as a lion, there are no bars that can keep this lion at a safe viewing distance. And another person talked about in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when they asked about Aslan and who is Aslan, and the answer was given that he is not safe but good. And so that's God. He brings that all. So you have God as bringing judgment as a lion, but God also for his people being a lion to deliver. And then it's probably not an accident in the book of Revelation where you have the lamb and then you have the lion from the tribe of Judah. All right, let's go back now. Chapter 5. And then he says, this judgment is upon them. I'll go and return to my place. And then he says, until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. That's giving some hope. So God's judgment comes upon them, but he's given some hope that they will turn and acknowledge him and seek him. All right, questions, comments on chapter 5? I did not compare the English with the Hebrew verse numbering, so if there's some kind of discrepancy, please speak up about that.
Verse 8 in chapter 5, at the very last comment there, behind you, Benjamin.
Yes. It's either it's a tribal cry, and it may be saying the enemy, Benjamin, is behind you. He's already conquered Ephraim. I don't know really, but it's an alarm. Could be a warning. Benjamin's right behind you. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? All right, chapter 6. So verse 1, come, let us return to the Lord. That sounds promising, doesn't it? He is torn, and He will heal us. He's smitten, He'll bind us up. After 2 days will He revive us. On the third day He'll raise us up that we may live in His presence. And let us seek to know the Lord. He's going forth as sure as the morning or the dawn, daybreak. He'll come to us as the rain, as the latter rains that waters the earth. Sounds like they're repenting, doesn't it? And then you have this strange thing where he says, or where they say, so this is the word. These are the words of the people. They thought of God, but after 2 days He'll revive us. On the third day He'll raise us up. Seems to be an idiom. After a short while, He'll raise us up. And so let us know Him. Let's seek Him. Verse 4, Ephraim, what shall I do to thee? So we have somebody else speaking. So the people are saying, okay, the end of chapter 5, acknowledge their guilt, and beginning of chapter 6, come, let us return to the Lord. Let's turn to the Lord. Then verse 4, what shall I do to you? And Judah's involved in this as well. What shall I do to you? And now what does he describe or compare their goodness or their mercy or their, pictures does he use? Yeah, as a morning cloud and as dew. What's that mean? Yeah, it's just short. It's shallow repentance. And he says, I've done everything I can for you. I have I've slain the prophets by the words of my mouth. And I don't know exactly what that means. I've killed the prophets by the words of my mouth. Maybe some of the rabbis suggest you had Elijah on Mount Carmel and in his contest with the prophets of Baal, and those prophets of Baal actually were killed. So I've killed them. Others say, I've sent my prophets and you killed them. And they were speaking the words of my mouth. And your judgment goes forth. It's like the light. It's just plain. It's out there. And here is another famous statement. I desire chesed or mercy. That word, I'll write it up here. Very important word. You transliterate it this way, but it's not pronounced chesed. Hebrew doesn't have a CH sound like church. It's chesed. Usually it's put this way, maybe with a dot under it, but I guess phonetically, chesed. It's variously translated loving kindness, mercy, and it's used often of God. It's roughly grace. It's Nelson Gleck, who was an archaeologist and lived a long time ago, and he did his PhD at Hebrew Union University, and he wrote his dissertation on chesed. He wrote a whole dissertation on that word. But it's what God desires of His people, and this loving kindness. It's faithfulness to the covenant, and that's shown by loving each other. Like John says, you can't say I love God and then not love your brother or your sister. So I desire chesed and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Well, didn't God command sacrifice and burnt offerings? Why does He say He desires chesed and knowledge? Do you think?
He wants the heart before the action.
That's right. It's not just the outward. Sometimes I hear people say what we have in the Old Testament is just the outward, just going through the motions. There are passages like this and passages in Torah as well. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. It wasn't that God said, well, as long as you don't actively kill somebody, you could hate their guts in your heart. God wanted the heart then, the whole person.
There's one of the prophets that says, rend your heart and not your garments. Don't just show an outward expression of repentance. It's got to be from the inside out.
Yeah.
Outside, external only.
Yeah, I think it's Joel. I can guarantee you this, it's either Hosea or Joel.
Yeah.
I don't know which one. I think it's Joel.
Well, David, in his prayer for forgiveness, mentioned that idea too. God wanted a broken spirit.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems they're just going through the motions and saying, let's return to the Lord. He's torn us, and God says, that's shallow. I desire kesed, I desire mercy, and knowledge of me. And again, knowledge in Hebrew is more than just knowing about, it's a relationship. But, and then here's something a little bit difficult. Verse 7, how do you have that translated? They like somebody, or like?
Like Adam.
Okay, well that's good. Because Adam means man, and some have understood it. They, like a man, have transgressed the covenant. But it seems he's talking about Adam. They transgressed the covenant as Adam. The disobedience that's there. They've dealt treacherously with me. Gilad is a city of them and works iniquity, and it's covered over with blood. It's this area. Gilad is a country rather than a city, but he's referring, I think, to the area of this. So it's singled out. All right, verse 9. Yeah, Jeremiah talks about that, where they were noted for their medical salves. Is it salves or salve? Salve. Yeah. Let's just go with ointment. They were noted for that, yeah. And there was no balm that could cure the disease that the people had.
The more languages you learn, the more you mess up words.
I guess so. Yeah, it was noted for that, and apparently here it was noted for sin and bloodshed. And as troops of robbers wait for a person, and so does the priest. And it may be saying the priests are on the side of the road. Okay, you pay me so much, and I'll help you in your idolatrous offering. They murder in the way to Shechem. Shechem was one of the cities of refuge at one point. So here they murder on the way to Shechem, and they commit this lewdness. And in the house of Israel, I've seen a terrible thing. Israel is defiled. And then Judah, there's a harvest appointed to you when I return the captivity, or the captives of my people. All right, that last verse in chapter 6. How many verses do you have in chapter 6? 11. Okay, so that is the last verse in chapter 6. Yeah, I was. I'm sorry. I didn't inflect it right. No. Yeah. I got 11. That's why I'm checking. All right, questions, comments on chapter 6?
In the first 3 verses where Israel's making their comments, it's all, they're talking about God. They never say, I've done wrong, we've done wrong, or we repent.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, there's no note of
they're
that.
just saying, talking about God. And
Let's return, yeah.
yes, but they don't say, we deserve to be, we need to be forgiven.
Yeah, certainly. That might be understood in when it says, come and let us return, because the word for return is shuv, and it means repent many times, because it is a turning. That's what That's what repentance means in the Hebrew, is turning, actual turning, a turning away from sin. The Greek word means change of mind, but it's based on the Hebrew, which means a turning from sin. In other words, you can't continue in sin and say, I repented. It's actual turning. So that might be implied in that, but even if it is, it's shallow. Because God says it's like the morning dew, or morning cloud, or the dew. Thank you. That's good. Anybody else? He sees through their shallow repentance. He sees the problem in their society. And then he describes it. Chapter 7. It's iniquity of Ephraim, the wickedness of Samaria. They commit falsehood. Thief enters in. Troops of robbers make it's out and open. It's out in the street. And let them not say to their heart, I remember all my wickedness and my doings have surrounded me. It's before my face. In other words, it's not. Let them not say, well, God's not going to see this. This is private. It's before my face. In verse 3, they make the king glad with their wickedness. A ruler who's delighted with the evil deeds of the people. The people are living wicked lives. The kings are living wicked lives. The princes are. They're all adulterers. He describes their sin as they're like an oven heated by a baker. And that's their lewdness, like a roaring flame. Even with a baker, there has to be a little bit of, you're not constantly just putting stuff in the oven. There's this kneading of the dough, and so there's kind of a break there. And he's not talking about literal baking here. But king after king after king. See, verse 5, there's instability. King after king didn't listen to God. And in verse 5, he may be saying, it says, on the day of our king. Maybe talking about a definite day. It could be a day of coronation of the king. The people he's hanging around, the princes, his cabinet, is making him drunk with wine. And their hearts like this oven, and they're lying in wait for the king, I think. The baker sleeps all night, in the morning it burns, and they're all hot as oven, and so they devour their judges. All their kings have fallen. Again, during this time, it's real instability. It's one king after another. One is assassinated. Verse 8 is, you probably heard this before, Ephraim is like a cake not turned. The idea is cake cooked on coals, and you have to turn it. It's going to burn on that side, and so they're too involved in the world. They're mixing themselves up in the world, and because of that, they have all these troubles. They have pride. They're like a silly dove that's just flying around and will get captured. And and throughout this is the idea too, they're calling to these Assyria and Egypt to come help us. And what did Assyria and Egypt do to them?
Carry them away.
Yeah. Well, Egypt said, I don't think we need to get involved in all that. But Assyria carries them into captivity. And God says, I'll spread my net. They don't have a sense of danger. And I'll bring them down. I'll chastise them. They have strayed from me. They're completely unmindful of God. They're not mindful of God. And they speak in lies about God, against Him. They haven't cried, in verse 14, to me with their heart. They wail upon their beds. They assemble together in these sacrifices or feasts. And they devise evil against me. Verse 16, they return, do you have, but not to the Most High? Or
But not up.
not upwards, okay. That's literally what the Hebrew says. It's not good for them, but it could be understood as they return, but they haven't returned to the Most High, to me. They're like a deceitful bow. What does that mean?
It doesn't shoot true, I guess.
Yeah. And it might even turn around and shoot you. Their princes will fall by the sword, by the cursings of the tongues. It'll be derision. And so they had these two traps, Egypt and Assyria, and they were betrayed. Questions on chapter 7. Hosea the chapters are not very long, but they're filled full of meaning and difficult things. So chapter 8 are prophecies of rebuke and some more indictments, and it's more of what we see, but some of it becomes a little more nuanced. They forgot God, and they appointed their own leaders, and they forgot the law. And so he says, and this is to Hosea, I guess, set the shofar to your mouth. Or it may mean, as one rabbi said, you are the shofar. You speak. And it's a warning of vultures coming against the house of the Lord. Now what's interesting, we talked about who's the audience. The audience is basically North Israel. But you have a statement here, house of the Lord. Where is the house of the Lord? It's in Judah. So, and he said some things about Judah up to this point as well. So it may be that he's speaking to Judah. They've transgressed the covenant. They've trespassed against Torah. Will they cry out, we know you? They've set up kings, verse 4, but he says, it's not from me. They make princes. I didn't know it. They make idols from their silver and gold. They're not listening to me. Now, verse 5, we do know this is North Israel. Your calf, O Samaria, is cast off. My anger is kindled. I mean, the craftsman made this. And it'll be broken into shivers. You sow the wind, you'll reap the whirlwind. And that's a pretty famous statement from Hosea, isn't it? Like Paul says that God is not mocked. We will reap what we sow. And they're swallowed up. And verse 9, they've gone up to Assyria. And some of this language that follows here is not exactly G-rated, but it's like a wild donkey seeking lovers. And Ephraim has hired lovers among the nations. They've hired lovers. And they've multiplied altars. It's all kind of altars to sin. And verse 13, he says they're making these sacrifices to me, but when he says literally let them sacrifice flesh and eat it, it's not talking about human flesh. He's just saying, you're saying it's sacrifice to me. You might as well just go ahead and have a barbecue because that's what it is. It's not a sacrifice. It's just a meal. Because the Lord doesn't accept it. And He will remember their iniquity, punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. And I don't think that's literal. That's Egypt is the house of bondage, famous house of bondage for God's people. You're going back into bondage, into slavery. And the reason is the verse 14, they forgot, Israel's forgotten his maker. Judah's built palaces, or Judah has multiplied fortified cities. Israel forgot her maker and built palaces. But I'll send a fire and burn it all up. Questions on or comments on chapter 8? It's kind of depressing, isn't it? But it has to be heard. And we have to hear God's judgment against sin. God takes sin very seriously. And Israel, though they are God's people, don't get a pass. And that's true today with God's people in the church. He takes sin very seriously.
They just become worse than the people around them,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. And that can happen with the church as well. It is a warning. And God kept His word, and He sent them into slavery. All right, chapter 9 is the punishment's coming, and here's what the exile is going to look like. And there's a lot of wordplay in this chapter. You loved the harlots higher, the prostitutes higher. And everything will fail for you. You'll not dwell in the Lord's land. You'll return to captivity. See in verse 3, you'll return to Egypt and you'll eat unclean food in Assyria. You're going into Assyria, and they did. 722, they went into slavery. And while you're there, you're not going to be able to pour out these wine offerings to God. You're not going to be able to offer these sacrifices to God. It won't come in the house of the Lord because you're going to be in a foreign land. And what will you do in the days of the appointed seasons, the feast, the day of the feast of the Lord? You're going to long and say, I remember back when we used to offer those sacrifices and the joy that was at those feasts. The days of visitation will come, recompense are come. And in verse 7, when he talks about the prophet is a fool, man, he's mad. Maybe that's saying you realize how you've been fooled by the false prophets. Or Hosea might be saying, here's what people said about me, and am I a fool now? You're in slavery. In verse 8, the watchman of Ephraim is a watchman for my God. There's even enmity in the house of God. They deeply corrupted themselves. In verse 9, so he gives some illustrations here from history, as in the days of Gibeah. And some of these just mentions, since we have to guess, but Gibeah is famous at the end of the book of Judges as a tragedy there, Judges chapter 19 and following. You remember how there's some epilogues to the book of Judges. Let's go over there, Judges chapter 19. Ruth is a appendix to the book of Judges. That's a bright spot. But then you have these others that are in the book. Judges chapter 19. And in those days, when there was no king in Israel, and each of these have to do with a Levite too. There was a certain Levite, and he took a concubine, and his concubine played the harlot against him. She went from him to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah, and she's there for 4 months. Her husband arose, went after her, trying to bring her back, and brought her back to her father's house. On the 4th day, verse 5, they got up early in the morning, prepared to go, and the girl's father said to his son-in-law, why don't you stay a little longer? And so they stayed longer, and he said, spend the night. And all that's on the 5th day, verse 8, they arose and started to go, and he says, just stay a little longer. And he says, I've been here long enough, I need to go. I'm not going to spend the night. So he goes on his way, and he gets near opposite Jebus, Jerusalem, and his concubine is with him, and the day's almost gone, and the servant said, let's go to this city of the Jebusites, spend the night there, and he says, no, let's go to Gibeah. And he said to his servant, let's approach one of these places. Gibeah is a city of God's people. The others are cities of Jebusites. So let's go to Gibeah. Gibeah belongs to the tribe of Benjamin. So they turned aside and to stay there in Gibeah, and they entered and they sat down. Nobody showed hospitality. An old man is coming out of the field, and he's from the hill country of Ephraim. He's staying in Gibeah, and he lived up. He saw this traveler. He says, "Where you going? Where you from?" He says, "I'm going from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote hill country of Ephraim, and I'm now going to my house." And the old man said, "Shalom to you. Let me take care of your needs, or all your needs, but don't spend the night in the open square." And so he took him into his house, gave the donkeys what they needed, and the men of the city, certain worthless fellows, surrounded the house, pounding the door, and they said to the old man, "Bring out the man who came to your house, we may have relations with him." And the man said, "No, don't do this. Don't act wickedly. He's coming to my house. Don't do this." So verse 24, "Here's my virgin daughter and his concubine." They bring them out. And they wouldn't listen. So the man seized his concubine, brought her out, and they raped her and abused her all night. And as the day came the next morning, he opened the door, and she was lying there at the doorway. And he said, "Get up and let's go." But there was no answer. She is dead. And so then he took a knife and cut her up in 12 pieces and mailed it all over to the tribes of Israel. And he said, "Nothing's like this ever been done." So this Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, is responsible for this. And so we're not going to read the other chapters, but there's a civil war there between the tribes and tribe of Benjamin. So in verse 9 here, he is talking about that tragedy. And God says, "I'll remember their iniquity and punish their sins." And I remember, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. If you're wandering around the wilderness and you need something to eat, or you're thirsty and you find grapes, that's something good. And the first ripe of the fig tree. But then they came, verse 10, to a place called Baal Peor. And that's another reference. That's in Numbers chapter 25. Yeah. Where you have Balak, king of Moab, and then Balaam, who is a prophet for hire. And Balak tries to hire him to pronounce curse on the Israelite people. And every time he does, it's a blessing. And that's fulfilling what God tells Abraham, that I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And then Balak says, "What good are you doing me?" But in the end, Balaam was successful through the women of Moab in seducing the Israelites. And so they worshiped their gods, the shameful thing. And by the way, the worship, Baal, of course, a very famous god in the Hebrew Scriptures, and in different localities, you have different names associated. But Baal Peor, the rabbis suggest, was worshipped. It's very horrible worship, and even defecation was a part of that. And the rabbis tell the story about this woman who was sick, who was ill, and she said, "If God heals me, I will worship and offer sacrifices to every god that's out there." And so she was healed. I don't know what her thinking was for doing that, but she was healed, and she started going around, and she came to Baal Peor, and the god of the Moabites, and she learned it involved defecation and terrible things, and she said, "No, I'm not going to do that." So it's a very shameful thing. Their glory is like flying away from a bird. It's departed from them. Their roots dried up. They, verse 16, shall not bear fruit. The root word for Ephraim is peri. Peri means fruit. Ephraim means fruitful. Ephraim is not fruitful. They shall bear no fruit. They'll be cast away because they didn't listen to me. All right, comments, questions on chapter 9. Chapter 10 is destruction's coming on Samaria, and Israel was a plentiful vine, or yeah, and brought forth fruit freely, and fruit increased. And again, there's play on that fruit because of Ephraim. And increased the altars, and the more they prospered, the more they built more altars to pagan gods. And their heart is divided, and they'll bear their fruit. And one day they will say, we have no king. We didn't fear the Lord. And they speak words, they swear falsely, they make covenants. In verse 5, the inhabitants of Samaria will be in dread for the calves of, there's Beit Aven again. That's another name for Beit El or Bethel. And so they're going into captivity, and they're going to mourn that they don't have these idol gods that they used to worship. And he says that the idol gods even will be carried into captivity with them. Just like in Jeremiah, God is talking about at the end of most all the prophets, they're oracles of the nations or against the nations. And there's an oracle against the Moabites at the end of Jeremiah. And he says that their God is Chemosh. And he says that Chemosh has gone into exile. God is, if you can't trust your God to protect you, and another God takes your God into exile. And that was a taunt that the peoples said about God's people when they went into slavery, that why didn't your God protect you? Your God has gone into exile. And some of the prophets even argued, God is not confined to any geographical place, and God is with you in exile. But He's going to return to the land as well. So they're mourning, and then verse 6 we have, again, that king, contentious, or what if it's a proper name. And Samaria, her king is cut off. It's just like, in verse 7, what do you have upon the water? A stick, a twig. It can be a bubble, it can be a foam. You know, if you're boiling water and those bubbles start coming up, and then it starts. But you turn the stove down and they disappear. If it's a twig, it's not going to stay in the water long. It's just going to wash on down. Your kings are like that. The high places will be destroyed. You'll cry out to the mountains, cover us, fall us. You sinned. You sinned just like in the days of Gibeah. And I will chastise you. You are a heifer, a young calf. This is interesting, verse 11. You are a young calf, and you love to thresh. And I will make you to ride and to plow. But don't do like I do in the morning, hit that snooze. Let's finish this chapter 10, and then we'll take a break. So the idea is threshing, in Hebrew dash, is easier than plowing. Plowing, you have to dig into the ground, and it's hard. It'd be hard work. Threshing is just pulling that sled around, rake around on top of the grain. And so threshing is easier than plowing. And what I need you to do is learn to plow again. So verse 12, you sow righteousness, and you reap according to mercy. break up the fallow ground. It's time to seek the Lord. Break up the fallow ground. So it's plowing. And he comes and causes righteousness to reign upon you. You plowed wickedness and you reaped iniquity. You've eaten the fruit of lies and you're going to suffer because of that. So I need you to plow righteousness. That's what he is saying. All right, and verse 14 is a reference that's kind of enigmatic. Does it say something about Shalman, spoiled? Somebody? Beit Arbel in the day of battle. And Shalman probably, I guess, is Shalmaneser, the Assyrian conqueror. Beit Arbel is a town in Galilee, and it talks about here the mother was dashed in pieces with her children. We don't know all the references of what this is talking about. The reader would know, the contemporaries of Hosea would know. And so has Bethel done that to you because of your great wickedness. When the new king comes and he promises something, he'll be cut off just like the other one. Your kings are not going to save you. All right, comments, questions on chapter 10 before we take a break. All right, thank you. Let's, 10 minutes? Suit everybody? Okay, chapter 11 is God's love for Israel. When Israel was a child, I loved him. And then that famous statement, out of Egypt I called my son. And that's used somewhere else in Scripture, isn't it? Matthew uses that to describe when Christ, the family of Christ, earthly family of Christ, went down into Egypt to escape Herod, and then they come back out of Egypt. And so it's filled full of meaning. But here in this context, the out of Egypt then is when God brought Israel out of Egypt. And he says the more they called them, the more they went from them. And then they sacrificed to not just one Baal, but Baalim, and offered graven images. I taught Ephraim to walk, took them by the hand. They didn't know that I was doing that. Verse 4, I drew them with the cords of, what do you have, of a person or of a man? Human. Yeah. Why he uses that phrase, I don't know, but the next phrase explains that with ropes or bands of love. And like one who would be compassionate to a working animal, take the yoke off their jaws, I fed them gently. He drew them, he's talking about. There is, the rabbis talk about if you buy something, you take acquisition of it like an animal. It's called kinyon. And there are two ways if you bought that animal to take acquisition. One is to call the animal, and the animal will follow you and come to you. The other way is to hit the animal and make the animal follow you. God says, I called and I drew you with bands of love. He says, yet you refuse to return. You're putting your trust in Assyria and your allies. And the sword, verse 6, will fall upon the cities. It's, Damocles' sword that's just hanging over and the verb that's used here is a verb that means to whirl or to dance. And so it's like a spinning sword it's revolving around, whirling around all the cities. It's not a good picture. And it will devour them. And in verse 7, my people are bent or hanging in suspense about returning me. The verb means sort of like they're in suspense. Why can't you make a decision? Well, we don't know. We just kind of, though they call them upwards, and nobody will lift themselves up. Now, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I surrender you, Israel? How shall I make you as Admah, and how shall I set you as Zeboim? Those were two cities that were in the plain when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. In Deuteronomy 29:22 mentions them. So how shall I give you up? And this reminds us, I think, of Jesus at the end of Matthew when he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, long to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks." My compassions are kindled. He doesn't delight in the destruction. I won't execute the fierceness of my anger. I will not return to destroy Ephraim. I am God and not man, the Holy One in the midst of you, and I will not come in fury. But he's going to execute wrath on them, isn't he? So, but it seems to be saying, I will not pour out all of my wrath that you deserve. Whatever whatever we get from God is grace, it's mercy. And then there's that statement about the lion that we talked about earlier, that they shall walk after the Lord. So if they're going to walk after the Lord, and if this repentance is heartfelt in opposition to what we saw earlier, he stands up for them like this lion, and they'll come trembling as a bird out of Egypt and as a dove out of the land of Assyria. And they'll dwell in their own houses. It's like a new Exodus. All right. The Hebrew stops at verse 11, but the English has another verse, doesn't it? It has verse 1. And the Hebrew verse 1 of chapter 12 fits in with what we have in chapter 11. So that might be part of it, I don't know. But the theme is deceit. They surround me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit, and yet wayward toward God, toward the Holy One who is faithful. All right, so questions, comments on chapter 11. Well, it's more of the same, this next chapter. And it's part of it, I mean, they turn away from God, they're serving other gods, offering sacrifices to other gods. Their moral life is showing that. They're not following God in holiness. They've turned to these allies of Egypt and Assyria. There's corruption in business. We see it here in this chapter here. They're striving after the wind. It's futile striving. That's like an idiom. It's an idiom that's used in Ecclesiastes. And they're following after the east wind. That's Sirocco wind, the hot wind. So it's meaningless what they're doing, but they're going to find judgment. They multiply lies and desolations. They made a covenant with Assyria. And oil, which is a staple product of the land of Israel, is carried into Egypt. And a part of this started, with Solomon. Because, Solomon, as far as we know, didn't fight any battles. He inherited all that from David. And his name, Shlomo, actually, means peace. And he builds God's house. He's able to do that. But and it says Solomon loved the Lord, but then it says Solomon loved all these foreign wives. And he actually, and it must have been a low point for Egypt, because Egyptian pharaohs didn't just marry off their daughters to anybody. You couldn't, just, hey, I'm here to marry a daughter of Egyptian pharaoh. So it must have been a low point, some people suggest. But he marries all that, and he even is forming alliances with Egypt. And so you got to think about the history that came out of Egypt. You going back down there? So verse 2 in chapter 12, then, the Lord has this, and that's that reeve, this controversy. But he says, with Judah, and I'll punish Jacob according to his ways. So here's an illustration about using Jacob. In verse 3, it says, in the womb he took his brother how? By the heel, Akav. And his name is Yaakov. His name, the heel grabber, or it's probably a play on words too. He could be the one that gives the heel. He's later on, Esau, after he stole the blessing, the birthright, then Esau ran off because he's afraid, or Jacob ran off because he's afraid Esau's going to kill him. And so the years go by, and God blessed Esau. He has a lot of people, a lot of family, and they meet up. And you remember when they're going to meet up, and then Jacob, he sends the children up, front, and you got some bad things going on too, with the wives and all the different children and the strife that's there. But and he's scared to death what Esau's going to do. And Esau meets him, and he says, he tries to offer him gifts, and Esau says, I don't need anything. God's blessed me with all this. But before that, before Jacob ran off, Esau said, when he stole that birthright for a bowl of red stuff, that's what the Hebrew says, stew. Yeah. It was a bad deal. I had an uncle one time, he said he was in grade school, he went to school, and he said somebody ripped him off on the playground, and he bought a piece of string, I think for a nickel. And he said, he's dead now, but I remember him even later in life, he said he still remembered that, and he said, I can't believe that I gave a nickel for a piece of string. But I guess so, back then.
A lot more than that today.
Exactly, yeah. So,
Thankful.
The other kids would be used car salesmen.
yeah. Or a string salesman. But when Esau realized that, he says, well, he's named right because he's Jacob to me. He ripped me off. He gave me the heel. So in verse 3, in the womb he took his brother by the heel, and then by his strength he strove with or wrestled with what? Do you have God? In verse 5 he strove or wrestled with, or verse 4 I mean.
Verse 3 it says
God.
Verse 4 it says the name.
Yeah. In verse 3, it is Elohim, and perhaps the better translation might be a godlike being or something along that line. But Elohim is used of human judges in Scripture, and it's also used sometimes for angels. So, however we try to work that out, you know what he's talking about when he's wrestled with that angel. And he prevailed, and at Beit El he'd find him. So. And the one he found is the Lord, the God of the armies. That's his remembrance. So therefore, turn to your God. It may be perhaps the point of these illustrations is God is in control. God sees everything. And God, look at this. He's worked through this history. He's brought you as a nation. But now you think God doesn't see what you do and you're doing whatever you want to do. And so verse 6, turn to your God, keep chesed, or mercy, and justice, and wait for God continually. The merchants, traffickers, something along, the balances of deceit are in his hand. He loves to extort. And Ephraim says, we become rich. I found my wealth. I'm the one who did all this. But God says, I'm the Lord your God, from the land of Egypt, and I'll make you dwell in tents again. I've spoken to the prophets, multiplied the visions. I've used all these different types of ways of illustrations. and you still won't listen to me. Verse 13, he used the illustration of Jacob again. Jacob fled into the field of Aram, and he served there for a wife, and he kept sheep. And by a prophet, the Lord brought him out of Egypt. And by a prophet, it's now the person Jacob's turned into the nation, Israel, and the prophet, it seems to be he's talking about, is Moses. And yet they provoke me most bitterly. Questions, comments on chapter 12? Chapter 13, when Ephraim spoke, there was trembling, commanded respect, exalted himself. But when he became guilty through Baal, he died. You signed a death warrant when you started worshiping Baal. Now they sin more and more and more, and they have all these idol gods, kissing calves. And they will be, verse 3 again, as the morning cloud and as the dew that passes away, as smoke that goes out of a chimney. Yet I am the Lord your God from the land of Egypt. Beside me there is no Savior. I knew you in the wilderness. It's almost like the idea now he's going to bring them back into the wilderness, and it's going to be a new beginning. Yet, verse 7, this is judgment again. I become as a lion, as a leopard, and as a bear. You're destroyed. And you can't just blame it on me, because in verse 9, you hurt yourself. Can't say, well, God did this. You hurt it's your destruction. And you said, give us kings, give us princes. And I gave you a king in my anger. It may be I took away in my wrath, maybe talking about Saul. And your iniquity is bound up. It's in a treasury. You think it's going to disappear, it's there. I know about it. And it will come upon you like the pain of a woman who is pregnant and giving birth. You're an unwise son. Verse 15, though you become fruitful among your brothers, this east wind will come again. And that east wind is talking about the Assyrians. They'll come, the wind of the Lord, and they'll dry you up. All right, in you have 16 verses in chapter 13, right?
Yes.
So Samaria will bear her guilt because they rebelled against God. They'll fall by the sword, and some very terrible picture there. Their infants dashed to pieces, women with child ripped up. Questions on chapter 13? All right, chapter 14 then is the last chapter. And it is a final call to repentance. Return, O Israel, to your God. It's up to your God. It's a preposition that's you don't expect it to be here. Expect another preposition. And the idea the rabbis say is you have to leave the environment of sin when you come to God. You're in this environment of sin and you love that environment of sin, so you have to leave this environment of sin when you come to God. You're not a victim of your environment. You can leave that. And there has to be, it's tripping you up, and there has to be a change of lifestyle. So verse 2, you admit your guilt with words and return to me. You say, forgive all the iniquity, take away, lift up the iniquity, accept what is good, And as an offering of a young bull, it's the offering of our lips. And that ties in again with the idea of it's not just the outward offering, it's the heart, it's the fruit of the lips. You have to also admit in verse 3 that who else can't save you? In verse 3, who cannot save you? Yeah, idols or Ashur. That's Assyria. Your military might, the work of your hands, the idols. You're getting to a point to where the helpless ones who are illustrated as fatherless, they're typical of helpless, the orphans. And you find mercy. Remember early on he says you name one of your child Lo Rukma, without mercy. That's the word mercy that's here is Rukam. You find this mercy. And I'll heal your backsliding. I'll love you freely. It's like the word is for a free will offering. You're not deserving any of this. My anger is turned away. I will be as dew to Israel. Dew is very important in hot countries like that. And then these beautiful pictures. You'll flourish as the lily, and the roots as Lebanon. Branches will spread out, and your majesty will be like an olive tree. Your fragrance is Lebanon. There's this idea of the shadow of this big tree. There will be those who dwell under it. You'll make grain to grow, blossom as the vine. The scent will be as the wine of Lebanon. It's famous, I guess, for its aromatic. I don't really know exactly what that means, the wine of Lebanon. And then Ephraim will say, what do we have to do anymore with idols? I respond and look on him. I'm like this green, leafy cypress tree and find fruit. And then we have the last verse. Somebody read the last verse for us, please.
Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them.
All right, thank you, Rick. So if this is dialogue, if in verse 8, Ephraim says, what do we have to do with idols anymore? We're putting our trust in God. Then the last verse, it seems God is responding and saying, I'll answer. And this is a finale that the wise person, let him understand these things. Let him, the word for understand, the verb for understand is a verb that's found many times in the wisdom literature. There's a preposition in Hebrew that means between, and this is related to that. And so it's do you have prudent or something or understanding in the next phrase? So whoever's wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is what? Discerning. Yeah, discerning is a good translation because it's based on this root of between. So it's easier to discern between something that's good and something that's blatantly sinful and evil. But sometimes it's not quite so easy, and it takes wisdom to discern between what is good and what is better. And you have that in Proverbs chapter 1. So the prudent, the understanding one, let him know them. And know, again, is more than just knowledge of facts. The ways of the Lord are upright, they're right. And the righteous or the just walk in them. But transgressors stumble therein. It's the same road, but transgressors stumble. And you return back to verse 1, where it's a call to repentance. Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, because you stumbled in your iniquity. It's the same verb. So the paths are straightforward for the upright, but they're full of stumbling blocks for the wicked. All right, questions, comments on chapter 14?
This says, that Lebanon was among the very first to produce wine. And so,
Is that what the World Wide Web said?
that's what
Okay.
the Wikipedia,
Oh, yeah.
Lincoln said that.
Yeah, who?
Lincoln.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Lincoln playing a Les Paul guitar. All right, any final questions on Hosea? All right, let's start on this next prophet then. And again, I'm not under any delusion that we're going to finish Joel tonight. We won't. Look. It's like slapstick comedy, isn't it? No, I was just going to cross my legs the other way. Well, I about finished that. So, all right, well, let's talk about the next prophet. His name is Yoel. And there are 13 Yoels in Tanakh. And we can't really tie him into anybody. So there's big difficulty of knowing exactly when he prophesied. And there are those who put him early before the exile, sometimes a little bit right before the exile, sometimes even after the exile. We just can't be sure about that. Yet the message of the book is timeless. Our difficulty might be in wondering what some of the references are to in his time historically, but we just don't have that. Another problem or difficulty with the book, I mean, tradition favors that it's early because Hosea is pre-exilic, he's early, and the next book, Amos, is pre-exilic, and so here you have Yoel between the two. So again, we don't know, and there are arguments, on all the different sides. I don't think in this class it's not edifying to me to go through all the arguments. But
Of the minor prophets, really only the last three are after the exile.
yeah, post-exilic, yeah,
Like I said, it's debatable about Joel, but
yeah.
but the first 9 of the 3, pretty much I think the consensus is those are pre-exile.
There are some who would date Joel as post-exilic after the exile, but again, yeah,
But he's with that other group, like you said, that is, some of the dates are for sure.
at least in the order of the canon, order of the
Yeah.
books that we have in Scripture.
But
So
the 3
yeah,
that are post-exile, they're all right there together.
Yeah.
They're the last 3,
yep. And look at chapter 2, verse 20 of Joel. I'll remove you far off from the northern one. And some argue that that's Assyria. And if that's Assyria, then he's in this same general time period as Hosea and as Amos. Even Ezra rabbis said, no, that's just talking about the locusts who came from the north of Judea. That might be as well. And that brings us to another thing about the locust plague. Is the rabbis are divided. Some say it is a literal locust plague, and some say no, it's just a picture of the armies, and then others say it's a literal locust plague that kind of morphs into human armies, and that's kind of seems the best to me. It's a literal locust plague as part of God's judgment, and then the armies are coming as well, and it's almost like it morphs into those armies. And in the book you do have locusts, and you have a drought, and you have fire along with this. Some would even date some of this. You remember during the time of Elijah when there was that drought? Some would date even Joel during that time as a contemporary of Elijah. But to look at this book then, It's a judgment on the nation. So we begin in verse 1 where it starts about talking about, really in chapters 1 and 2, you have this locust plague that's coming. I think it's a literal, real locust plague. It might just be a picture of something else, but and that is going to lead into the rest of the book. So, chapter 1, the word of the Lord that came to Yoel, the son of Bethuel. And then he starts talking about, have you ever, you old men, listen to this. Has there ever been in your days that there's something like this locust plague? Tell your children about it. Let their children tell their children, generation to generation. And then he starts talking about the locusts. And he uses 4 names or 4 terms for the locusts. And they seem to be getting worse. What one leaves, the next one takes, and then the next one takes. Nothing's left. They're variously translated as the chewing locusts, and the just swarming locusts, creeping, crawling locusts, consuming or stripping locusts. Yeah, and so they come through and just strip everything. In verse 5, he says, "Wake up, you who are merry with wine." It could be drunkards, and you weep, you drinkers of wine, because what's pressed from the grapes, it's cut off from your mouth. And really, the point of all this is, if all that's cut off, there's no sacrifices. You can't bring sacrifices to the temple. And then in verse 6, what is it? So we've been seeing locusts that came, and so verse 6, who does he say has come? A nation, yeah. A people has come.
But that again could be referring to locusts.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as huge as the nation.
Yeah, and that's how the Rabbi Rashi interpreted that. He said it's a nation of locusts that have come. Mighty, without number, like the teeth of a lion, jaw teeth of a lioness. And again, we have all this lion language. And they've just destroyed everything. Just snapped the fig tree, cleaned everything bare, and the branches. And so it's a devastating thing. I read about or heard about a locust plague in 1874 in Kansas, and there was a woman who wrote about it and talked about it, and she said she had on a dress that was green, or a white, and had a green stripe on it, and the locust just ate the whole stripe off just while she was just standing there. And it talks about they're outside the house and just all over. Were described by a little boy as a moving gray screen, and so it can just darken the sky. And you can find pictures. I think there's an old National Geographic, I think I have it scanned in, that talked about a locust plague in Israel in the 1920s, and it had some pictures. And I remember one, of course in black and white, but it was a picture of a tree that was just, had all leaves and everything, and then it's just nothing. And it's just a matter of, seconds. And so just imagine, and the sound of all that as they're moving through and destroying everything. And if you are a people that's dependent on agriculture too, that's very devastating.
Of course, it makes you think of the plague on
Certainly.
Egypt, but it shows the impartiality of God. It's like, well, I did this to Egypt, but I'll do it to you too.
Yep. And it's not a minor thing, because he says, you old men, can you think of anything? You tell your children, tell your grandchildren, that they'll tell generation to generation. Has there been anything like this before? Well, in one sense there was in Egypt, but again, this is devastating. So what should the response be? The response should...
But in Egypt, it didn't affect them, though, did it?
That's right. As God's people, they're protected.
So they,
Yeah.
word of mouth and
Yeah, you're right. So just move through, I think I talk about verse 7, you made my fig tree into splinters. The branches are just destroyed. So what is to be the response? The response is to be lament, mourning, like a young woman wearing sackcloth for the husband of her youth. The idea is she is recently married, newly married, and now she has lost her husband. The grain offering, the drink offering is cut off from the house of God. The priests mourn. Those who minister to the Lord mourn. The field is wasted. The land mourns. The grain is wasted. The new wine is dried up. The oil languishes. And be ashamed, you plowmen, you vine dressers. The wheat and the barley harvest is perished. Vines withered, fig tree languishes, pomegranate, palm tree, apple tree, all the trees are just destroyed. So what's the response? Lament. Verse 8. Verse 13, what's the response? Gird yourself and lament, you priest, and you wail, wearing the sackcloth. You call a fast, you sanctify a fast, call a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land to the house of your God and cry out to him. It's this cry lasts for the day. And then verse 15, we're introduced to a theme that's in this book several places, and that's Yom Adonai, the day of the Lord. This is a day of judgment. Amos is going to deal with this theme as well. He's going to say, you long for the day of the Lord. It's going to be a day of judgment for you. It's like a man fleeing from one animal, and he thinks he's fast enough, and he gets inside a house, and he's like, I'm safe, and leans up against the wall, and a snake bites him on the hand. The day of the Lord is at hand. So this day of the Lord occurs here in 1:15, 2:1, 2:11, chapter 2, verse 30, chapter 3, verse 14. And there's some difference in numbering in the Hebrew and Joel as well. Food's cut off. Everything's desolate. Even in verse 18, the beasts are groaning and the herds of cattle are confused. They're perplexed. They have no pasture. And how do you have verse 18 translated? The latter part.
Even the flocks of sheep suffer.
They suffer. The verb translated suffer there is a verb that means to bear guilt. We saw in Hosea chapter 5 verse 15 where it talks about bearing guilt. So he says the flocks of sheep are bearing guilt. Now, again, we can't press it too far, but the idea is that the innocent are suffering through this, and even these animals are suffering. So the locusts destroyed everything. It's caused this famine. Fire is breaking out everywhere. Fire has devoured. The beasts of the field long for and pant for you. The water brooks are dried up. The pastures are just burned. All right, that's a pretty bleak picture. Any comments, questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Over in verse 8, is that Virgin Alma there? Well, like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the her bridegroom of her youth?
That's not Alma, that's Betula. Betula means a woman of marriageable age. This woman is either newly married or betrothed. Betula. It can be translated virgin.
They did.
Yeah, obviously it can be since it was. But if we understand it as virgin, then it's probably has something to do with betrothal rather than what we would think of a marriage. And probably most or all of you know this, that Hebrew marriage cultures, in Hebrew marriage culture, there was a betrothal period, which was, it's like an engagement, but it's more than an engagement. Because Joseph and Mary, you know, were betrothed. He didn't want to put her away. To break her betrothal, there had to be a bill of divorce. So they're not married yet, and the marriage hasn't been physically consummated. So the girl could be a virgin in that sense. Either way, she's lost the one she's betrothed to, or if she's married, she's lost her husband. And I guess you could call her, the one she betrothed to, her husband as well, because it does, the husband of her youth. It's a good question.
Does Alma have to be a virgin?
I think it does. I don't know. Alma's in Isaiah, right?
Yes.
No, Alma can be a woman of marriageable age. And so, but it can't, context tells you if it's a virgin as well. Now, well, we're not studying Isaiah, but I think it had meaning in Isaiah's time, and yet it is, as Matthew says, a prophecy of Christ.
We need about 14 hours on Isaiah 7.
Yes, yeah, and I would understand it as it had meaning in Isaiah's time, and yet it is prophesying about the virgin birth of Christ, as Matthew
That makes sense.
and their inspiration
But it
understands it.
definitely had to have meaning in Isaiah's time.
Yeah. Perhaps we'll look at Isaiah sometime and talk about that, but it has become controversial among some people. Okay. Thanks, James. Any other thoughts, comments, questions on chapter 1? All right, chapter 2 then, he says, you need to sound the alarm. This is like announce emergencies. Go out in the square, the alarm sirens. Blow the shofar. You blow it in Zion. Sound an alarm. Shout it out in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land know, because the day of the Lord comes. It's at hand. So again, there's another reference to the day of the Lord. Day of the Lord in the prophets means the day when God vindicates His name. And it can be a day of salvation when He rescues His people, but it can be a day of judgment for His people if they don't listen. And there are successive days of the Lord. Now there is a final day of the Lord that's future for us. And yet all of these are looking to that, but it's a day God will not tolerate sin, and judgment will come. Like at the end of Joel, he talks about in the valley of Jehoshaphat, and he talks about in the valley of decision. What is that passage where sometimes I hear people preach and they use this? Chapter 3, I think, verse 14. Multitudes, it's multitudes. It's this roar of the crowds in the valley of decision, because the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. And before that and after that, he talks about this valley of Jehoshaphat. And I don't think it's talking about a valley that's related to somebody named Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat means God judges. So who's making the decision there? God's the one making the decision. So it's a valley of judgment. All right, let's go back now to chapter 2, and we'll go a few more minutes, then we'll stop. This day, in verse 2 of chapter 2, is a day of darkness, gloominess. Fire goes before them, and so he's going to talk more, I guess, about the locust then, describing the locust, but it appears to me, and I may be wrong, but it's sort of morphing into an army that's going to come and bring. So God can control the locusts. He sent the locusts into Egypt. He can use locusts as punishment for His people. God also is bringing the Assyrians against His people. God brings the Babylonians against His people. God can deliver His people. So if these are still the locusts, and they appear to be, it's like you hear the sound like chariots way off as they're coming. Somebody said that the sound of the swarm of locusts can be heard 6 miles off. On the tops of the mountains, they're leaping around, they're devouring, they're like wearing their battle armor, and then people are just in anguish when they hear this. They're running like mighty men, climbing walls. If some of them are killed, they just walk right over them and continue on. They leap on the city, they run on the wall. And then verse 10, the earth quakes, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. And that's a language that we're going to hear later on in Joel. That's almost like apocalyptic language. Apocalyptic language is language in a crisis. It's like today is the 12th, yesterday was September the 11th. In the historic of our nation, terrible September 11th. We know what happened, and Alan Jackson wrote a song that came out shortly after that, and it said, "Where were you when the world stopped turning?" Did the world physically stop turning that day? No, that's language that songwriters would use, and we understand that. Apocalyptic language is like that, and it's a tremendous thing. God's doing a tremendous thing. It's happening. Now, I know what chapter 2 refers to because an apostle tells us that this is that. And it's referring to the day of Pentecost. And he quotes from Joel chapter 2. We're going to have to wrestle with Joel chapter 3 when we get there. But you have this language about the heavens trembling, the sun being darkened. It's a big thing God is doing. Verse 11, great is this day of the Lord and very terrible. And who can endure it? So what should be the response? Verse 12, turn to me with all your heart, and with fasting, with weeping, lamentation. And here's the passage that Scotty told us about. Tear your heart, not your garments. Turn to the Lord your God, because He is gracious. He is compassionate. He's long-suffering. He is abundant in mercy. And He is gracious. He is long-suffering. The Hebrew word long-suffering, it's a phrase, Eric, aphayim. Aphayim is the nose, and it means long nose. And it's the idea of an animal, like a bull, it gets angry, it starts snorting, and this is the complete opposite of that. God is long-nosed. In the Hebrew grammar, there's an essay in there, the grammar we're using, about the long nose of God. But it's talking about He's long-suffering. And He is great and there's Kesed again. This is echoing Exodus 34 and what the rabbis call 13 attributes of God. We're going to stop there. Any questions, comments?
Just a point on long suffering. W. Vines points out that God is not patient. It's not one of His characteristics.
Yeah.
He's long suffering.
Yes, it's interesting. We'll pick up with this verse here in chapter 2 next week, and we'll talk more about that. I hate to just go over that real quick, those attributes of God that are there. Any final thing you want to say? Any questions? Of course, the Lord could return before next week, so you'll have all your answers then. But all right, well, I do appreciate you being here. It's a highlight of my week, and I know we're supposed to be in threatening weather, so I appreciate you coming out tonight. William, will you lead our closing prayer, please?
Eleanor Gilmore.
Okay.
You'll remember Jennifer's granddaughter, Jennifer Boulware's granddaughter.
We thank Heavenly Father so very much for this opportunity we have to look into your word, to glean order of things that you expect us to follow. We pray, Heavenly Father, we'll strive to do that to the best of our ability. We pray for this young girl that, in turn, we pray, Heavenly Father, that you'll be with us as we continue through this week. Forgive us our sins. It's in Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, William. Have a good rest of the week. Not just William, but everybody.